Right, so welcome, and I'm going to talk to you about the myths, musts, and migraines of migrations. Who has actually practiced saying that out loud 5 times fast? Okay, well, just do without it then. So my name is Mark van Gent. I work for Lisbon, which is a Drupal shop in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. But enough about me, let's talk about you. Can I see some hands? I think I kind of know what the most people will answer, but let's see, who here considers himself or herself a developer? Yeah. Any project managers in the room? Okay. Side owners? People who like to call the client sometimes. Someone who is none of the above? Okay. What do you consider yourself? A designer? Excellent. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Well, the good part is that this talk's going to be a bit for everyone. I'm going to do some really technical code stuff, but also some of the human aspects that are also involved in migrations. So let's start with a quiz. The key to a successful migration is A, a clean, good source data, B, a committed cooperating client, or C, plenty of development time. Which one of you think it's A? No one. B? C? All right, okay. Well, let me tell you. You were all right. All of those answers are necessary for a good migration, in my experience. So let's get started and see what we're going to talk about today. I'm focusing on non-Drupal to Drupal migrations. Firstly, because that's what I have most experience with, what our clients often need, but also because I can't do anything. And some of the concepts I will be talking about are similar for Drupal to Drupal migrations as well. So you will still learn about that as well. So we're going to have a look at the source, process, destination flow that is inherent to all migrations. Look at how you're going to set up a migration. Writing my first migration. Having a closer look at source data, process plugins. Talk a bit about the project context, and then I will close up with some final tips, just random bits and bobs that I ran into when developing migrations. I hope I'm not in front of the slides here, but I'll try to step aside. Okay, so here's the first myth. Migrations are complicated. It's about a source, a process, and a destination. Migrations are straightforward, literally. So, source, what does that mean? Well, you can start with a database, a file, a URL, a REST API, something. It doesn't matter. And all that matters is that from this first initial blob of thingies, you want to get a list of things, one result per migration item. And the source should also define a unique ID per item in that source. Then comes the processing step. Processing does a couple of things. It maps source values to entity fields or properties. It can also transform data. So these thingies that you got but may not be entirely complete, you want to make them into complete things that you can actually store. And a good thing about process in Drupal migrations is that they're chainable. We'll talk about that later. And then finally, the destination. The destination is a node or a term or something. The destination is about writing this collected data that you processed to the Drupal database. Drupal migrations mean that the destination can support rollback. So you can undo what you migrated. And finally, it saves a mapping from this source ID to a destination ID. So you had an ID, and well, when it gets imported into the Drupal database, it might get a new node ID. So 1 would be mapped to 40 in this example. So that's what the destination part is about. So obviously, when we're going to work with migrations, you need some tools. So here's the tool set that I've been using in migration projects. Modules. There's Migrate in core, which is great that it's in core, of course. It has the API, it has some base functionality, and it allows you to write continuous migrations with ID mapping. So you will have a record of which source ID was imported, migrated to which destination ID. And this word continuous is important because it means that you can run a migration over and over again. And if more data is added in the source database, then incrementally those items will also be imported in your destination database. So it's not just a one-time thing. You can just keep running it or roll back and redo the whole thing again, which is great. Okay, so then Migrate Plus. Migrate Plus is a module that does some extra things for your migrations. You can define migrations as config entities, and we'll see later how that looks. And it contains some additional plugins, some enhancements, some data parsers, for instance, if you want to import XML and parse it, or CSVs. It has some things for authentication, so you can make authenticated calls to your source. And it contains some example modules. And then finally, there's Migrate Tools, which offers a couple of drush commands and a UI for running migrations. Well, so this is my tool set when it comes to modules. Then there are some other tools like drush. Well, I don't think we need to explain drush. There's Drupal console, which is in some way similar to drush. One of the nice things is that it can scaffold out some plugins, so you can really easily get going with creating certain migration plugins. And you will probably need a database manager, at least if your source is a database, because, well, there's just a lot of digging and analyzing the data that you got before you can actually start working with it and migrating it. And if you're going to do a migration like this, you're going to write a custom module. And this is about the structure that your module will have. Of course, there's an info YAML because it's a module. It's going to contain config, install, and some YAMLs. This is where the migration entities are defined. And then finally, got a plugins where you do some custom PHP. And usually you mainly need process and source plugins. Cool. So let's dive into that and see how it actually works. Migrate groups, migrations, and that's all you need to go forward with the migration. So here's a must. Handwritten YAML. So this was something weird to me when I first started. I was reading this blog post and said, okay, so I need YAML. Where do I get the YAML? And oh, wait. And then like 15 minutes later, it dawned on me, I actually have to write this YAML yourself, which is not that difficult, but it was just some export format to me before this. But you can just write your own YAML, and it's pretty readable. This is just example YAML. It doesn't have anything to do with migrations, but I mean, you can just easily see what's happening, who's Mark, and who his colleagues are, and what their roles are. It's a readable format, which is nice. So then we have a concept of migration groups. Sometimes you just need one group, but migrations can be grouped, and one of the good things is that there can be shared configuration for one group, and we'll see an example of that later. And then in the UI, you will see the migrations that you got and a button to list all the migrations inside that group. It's not really important, but you need to know about it. And And this is what the YAML looks like for a migration group. You can find an example also in the Migrate Tools module, and this is how you define such a group, got an ID and a label, and then some shared configuration. This shared configuration is important. You know, when in settings PHP, you define a database, you say default, and then the good stuff comes. Well, this key, migrate, this replaces the first default. So when you specify multiple databases in your setting PHP, by specifying this source key, migrate, your migration will know to not use the default database, but to take the other database as a source. So that's what it does. And so this is what it will look like in setting PHP. Databases migrate default instead of default. So then you need a source. I'm taking a database as an example. So, but this source can be something else as well, like a CSV or, well, basically anything that can hold data. In PHP, you want to be writing a class which extends source plugin base. You can also scaffold it out with Drupal console, Drupal generate plugin migrate source, and that will generate a file for you. There's no Drush 9 generator for this yet, so if anyone wants to supply a patch to the Drupal code generator project on GitHub, feel free. By the way, I see people taking pictures, which is fine, obviously. There's also the PDF with all the code on the Drupal Dev Days website, so you can just download it all and look through it. Right, so what does a source plugin actually look like? So here we see an example. I'm calling it demo node artist because it's a source plugin for artist content. I have this fictional database where artists and CDs and albums are stored in. So here you see it extends SQL base because it's a SQL database source. This is the most important function that you're going to be implementing in your source plugin, which is the query function. This is just defining a query to run on the database, which should return the list of artists in this case. And then there are two more functions, methods in the class. Fields defines which fields are available for each row, and the getIDs method specifies which field should be seen as the unique ID, which is important for the mapping. So next, you're going to write the migration config. So this is one of these things that's going to config install. So this is a configuration that will be imported the first time when you install the module. So what we see here is a migration ID. Every migration needs an ID. You give it the human name. It's in a certain group. So here's the source plugin. This refers to the annotation that we wrote in the source plugin class. And then this is the process part. The process part where the mapping happens. So here you see that for the title, we're taking the name field from the row that is generated by the source plugin. And we're having a type. It's just a default value and setting it to artist, which actually means I'm generating a node. Plugin entity node is what the destination is. And I'm creating nodes of the type artist. Of course, you want to make sure that an artist bundle actually exists, but that's outside of the scope of migrations itself. So, like I said, this is a config entity, and it's stored in the config install directory of your module. This means that it's imported when you enable the module. But obviously, you're going to be testing and writing and fixing bugs and stuff. So keep in mind that every time you update this file, you have to import it again. So with Drush, it's easy to do that. Config import -- partial -- source equals, and then you provide the directory, the path to the directory where this YAML is stored. And this will import your YAML again and again every time you make a change. Otherwise, you won't see the change actually taking effect. And then it's a go. This is how easy it is to write your first migration. You just do drush migrate import and then the ID of the migration you just wrote, and that should do it. Or you can use the UI. So you go to the migration group, click list migrations, and then here you got your migration, and you click execute. The drush method tends to be a bit faster, but what's great about the UI method is that it usually makes debugging easier, because command line debugging can be difficult, especially when you're working with Docker, VMs, Lando, whatever kind of complicated setup you're using. Debugging from the UI is usually a bit easier. So let's talk about source data. Source data is really important. It's the only thing you have to work with. And to get the right source data, you're going to have some human interaction. And as we all know, that's where things get messy. So here's a myth. Your client will tell to you the data is clean and complete. Well, oops, what was that? Ouch. So this, wait. So if you're using reveal.js, don't press the B key. Anyway, so believe me, the data is not clean, it is not complete. If you find your client that actually delivers clean and complete source data, call me, and it's going to be a party, seriously. No, okay. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's okay. I mean, we don't expect source data to be complete, but you have to know, and you have to know how to address it and how to work with that. So you're going to need to ask your client a lot of questions. How can we access the data, for instance? Can we have direct access to the database? Which can be great. It means that you don't have to shove around database exports and stuff if you can just directly connect to the live database. You probably don't want it, but if you can have it, wow. But maybe you have an export, or maybe there's an API you can connect to, or maybe there's nothing. Just you have to ask and you have to know. Probably it's a site that is still live. I mean, until your new site is live, this database keeps being updated and changed. So talk to your client and ask them, how do we get the updates, and how often do we get the updates? Will they be complete new exports, or are they incremental? And if they're incremental, do they have timestamps, or also if they're not incremental, can you figure out what has changed, or is it just something that you have to go and figure out yourself from the data? And how about assets? PDFs, images, they're usually not in a database, and good chance they didn't yet think of that. And also talk about what size are we talking about. Because I've seen one project where they said, okay, yeah, we just give you the database dump and we'll put it on some server and you can download it. Well, it was a pretty slow FTP connection, and that for a multi-hundreds gigabyte database dump, it was no fun at all. So anyway, whatever you do, make some friends at the supplier side. You have to work with these people, so don't blame them for having a slow FTP server. Don't call them out for not knowing where the PDFs are, because you need them as friends, seriously. So once you got this data, you're going to analyze it. And then ask the most stupid questions you can think of. Like, what does it all mean? Don't assume. Ask. They probably don't know either. They have to go find out, but that's okay. Ask them if everything has a unique, unchanging ID. Use that word, unchanging. For instance, do all users have a unique email address? And if they do, can they change their email address themselves? But also simple things like, do all articles have titles? Yeah, seriously, don't assume. They might not have titles. Are records being added and deleted? And if yes, are those unique IDs reused for new content? Because that will get you in trouble. Does the data contain duplicates? They're going to say no. Seriously, did you check? Sometimes, well, most of the times, there are some duplicates. It's okay, we can deduplicate, but we have to know. And finally, do not assume that people know their own data. So still, even if you have asked all those questions, you will have to check and you will run into weird things that you didn't expect. Just, that's okay, but we need time for that. Okay, and then start planning. Make choices together with your client, preferably. And don't spend 4 hours automating something that would take 8 hours manually. Because those 4 hours are going to be more than 4 hours, or you find a bug and someone says, hey, let's do this again, and you say, well, I have to change something. Well, 8 hours manual work is fine, especially if the client can do it and you can focus on the really hard stuff. And agree on what you will not do. If you ask what needs to be important, they will just say, well, everything. That's not good enough. So talk about that and see what really matters to them. Do you need the last changed date from the old database? Do you need someone who initially authored something? Do all those authors need to be entire user entities, or can it just be names in a text field? All those kind of things matter, so make sure you discuss that. Have the result tested. Automated tests will be excellent, but also make sure that your client looks at it. See if it works functionally, but also see if the content really is what the client expects to be. And finally, write a plan for the go live. You cannot do this early enough. Talk about content freeze, because in those last few days right before go live, preferably you want a content freeze so there are no more updates to the database, to the source database, especially if from that point on they need to supply a new database dump to you, which you have to download from this slow FTP server, etc. You need some time for this. Pick dates and instruct the editors what to do and who to call if something goes wrong. So, here's a myth. Migrations are simple. And I know I just said that migrations are straightforward, which they are, but you're always going to run into complicated, weird thingies that you didn't expect. So prepare to write custom processes, because that's what they're for. Now, processors are awesome. I really like the concept of processors, the way they're implemented in the Drupal migration things. This is the most simple processor, which just does nothing more than mapping. It's a get processor, which just says, okay, get me the name property and map it to the title field. And if you think this is simple, there's even shorthand for that. So in your process, in the process part of your migration YAML, you would just say, okay, so the title comes from the name property on the source row. That's it. This is really your minimal required process config, because Drupal at least needs to know which value from the source is mapped to which value in your destination. Now, processes can have configuration, which is cool because it means that you can write processes that are a bit more flexible, that can be used for multiple use cases or multiple variants of the same use case. So for instance, this is an example of how you would use the default value processor. So the type is the node type, is what it's being mapped to. Plugin says, okay, we're going to use the default value plugin, and then it takes a configuration value. And the configuration key default value is the string album. So this means that now in the plugin, you can access this configuration default value to return this album string. So it makes your configuration available in the process plugin when it's executed. Okay, so migrations often must be linked together. When you have multiple migrations, for instance, you're importing users and you're importing nodes, then those users can be authors of these nodes. So if they're connected in the source database, you want to keep that connection, migrate that connection to your new database. But of course, these users that you've imported have new IDs in your Drupal site. So when you get a source article or a source content which says this was written by user 13, then in your Drupal database, this user 13 is not 13 anymore. It's got a completely different ID. So that's where migration lookup processor comes in. So you just say, okay, field artist, this is an entity reference field. I'm going to use the migration lookup, and I'm going to see what happened in the demo node artist migration. And I'm taking it from the artist ID source. So if you do this, what happens is actually says, get the ID of the entity which was created when demo node artist imported this artist ID. So it goes back to its mapping table in your Drupal database, looks up, okay, so this source artist ID was imported into some Drupal entity ID. So that's what I'm going to connect this new entity to. And this way, all your relations stay intact. Now, chaining. I already said I would be talking about chaining. Chaining means that you can actually run multiple processors on the same piece of data. And it will just be handed from one to another. So, for instance, in this example, we're having the user ID of a field. I'm first running it through an author deduplicate, which is like a custom deduplication processor, which I wrote. Then you can go to the migration lookup plugin, and then finally, if it doesn't result in a correct value, we are using a default value. So step by step, this will result in a value that is then finally stored in the database, which is great. It really works very well. And what I also like is that it's still pretty readable to understand if it's a migration that someone else wrote, to understand what's happening and how this thing works. Okay, so creating a process plugin. To write a process plugin, you need something that extends process plugin base, which you can generate with Drupal console and also with Drush 9. So let's look at some real sample code here. I had an idea for a custom processor, and I thought, okay, so when we're working with this music database, when I'm importing an album, let's connect to the Spotify API and enrich this data with a release date and a URL. So I'm writing this class. It starts off, of course, with an annotation because we're doing Drupal 8, and specifying a name for my plugin. Oh, called Spotify info. So I'm going to skip a bit over this because some things you will just have to believe me that it works. But anyway, what happens, this is the most important part, we are implementing a transform method. Transform is the method in a process plugin that takes the value that is put into it, transforms it, does something with it, and then returns another value. So here we're using this configuration. So you see we've got a plugin that can take configuration from the YAML. I'm building a query and I'm executing the Spotify query method. So this actually means that a query is sent off to the Spotify API and you get some data back. So that's the Spotify result. And then we're using the property configuration to dig into the Spotify result and return something from this array, which would either be the release date or the URL, the Spotify URL, because that's the two things I was interested in. So here we have what actually the Spotify query info and the Spotify query methods do. I'm going to skip over this for now because it's beyond the scope, but you can still see it in the PDF if you're interested. So this is where it really gets interesting. So in your processor, to use this plugin that we've written, you would do this. I have a field release date. So what goes into the field release date? Well, we're using the Spotify info plugin, and we're using two values as a source. You can do that. It will just be an array that is passed into the plugin, and so you have two values that you can both use to do something with. So the title and the artist name. Now, here are two configuration items, type and property. And so this property means that where to look in this array that we get back from Spotify to get the data that we're interested in. So, and here for the Spotify URL, we are again using the same Spotify info plugin. So this is where the power of this configuration thing comes in. We only wrote one process plugin, which we can reuse and just pass a different property so it looks somewhere else in the array that is returned. And because it looks somewhere else, we get a different value back from the processor, which is then stored in this other field. By the way, you might notice that there is a slash here. Some fields are composed of multiple values, like a link field that has a link title and a link URL, and this is how you specify that this value has to go into the URL column and not into the title column. So wait. So that's all there is to it. This actually works. I've tested it. And, well, so what you see is that with, well, in my opinion, a reasonable amount of code, you can write really powerful and reusable methods to use in your migration. So, it's not all good. Migration never comes alone. And if everything was perfect, we wouldn't be building a new site and there wouldn't be a migration. So we have to talk about complexity a little. So your client has some goals. And when you're talking with your client, you really have to think about what it means that they're saying. Because they probably say, okay, so we need a new site. So you're thinking what it means. Okay, so that might mean we got new URLs. So think about what it means for your migration. Redirects, aliases, making sure that Google doesn't encounter all 404s at a certain day and your page ranking goes down. Think about it. Your client will say, oh, we need to do design. Well, look at it, and if you notice, okay, so now every single node has an image, but that image may not be in the source database. It's something you have to solve. And the client said, okay, we need new navigation. Well, that may mean that you will see revised categories. So there might be a mapping of old categories to new categories. And they want a new workflow, which might mean that there are new, different input filters. So the content that used to look great on the previous website now has its paragraphs filtered out or something, and suddenly things break down. But still, the client will expect that the existing content will magically fit into your new website. So this really is something that you have to discuss with your clients. All this complexity is changes squared. The more changes you need to make during this migration process, the more complex it gets. You really want to reduce the number of changes introduced with a migration. So if you think back to the Spotify plugin I just showed you, the code is interesting, but for your project, it's a really bad idea. You don't want to be working with something that might come from the API. An API might break, an API might be unavailable, an API might have a limited number of requests you can make each day. You don't want that to interfere with your migration, really. So it's best to just keep things as simple as possible. Just do a really plain migration and then try to fix the other things later. And because of this, it's a must to start early. Adapt your site content, the old content, and the future needs. Migrate early and keep importing. And make your estimations generously and then double it. Because, well, it's just going to take time, and in the end, you will find something else, and they say, oh, but isn't this included? No, you said, would you just do the notes, and now you're telling me there are comments on your site. You never talked about it. Well, so yeah, you're going to need time. So let's see how we're doing for time. If we could, yeah, we can do some tips and tricks. Cool. Nice. So you want to save time because it's already going to take quite a bit of time to write these migrations and test them and test them again and again. So everything you can do for performance is cool because you're waiting. You have less waiting to do before your migration has actually run. So 2 things. Disable your search indexing and run your migrations with Drush. The first one is really a big thing, and Drush also makes it run a little faster than when running from the UI. However, like I said, if you need debugging running from the UI might still be preferable. Another way to save time is using a reduced data set. This migration I've been working on a couple of months ago contained over 22,000 articles. So they're going to take a long time before they're all imported. And usually for testing, you don't need that much. If I take 1 in 100, I got 220 articles. It's plenty to test with. So this is what I did. In my settings PHP, I just set up a simple setting, which is a reduce factor. In this case, 100. And then in my source plugin, or every source plugin I want to apply this to, I check if this reduce factor is actually set. And if it is, I'm adding a where clause to my query, which actually says, okay, so only when the ID is divisible by 100 exactly, then I'm importing it, and otherwise, let's skip it. So this worked great. And to me, this was preferable to just saying, okay, I'll put a limit on it. Because, of course, you can easily say, okay, just take the first 100. But in my situation, I had a database which was these 22,000 articles went way back to somewhere in the 1960s up to last year. So if I would just have taken the first 100, I would have only articles from 1960 and 1961, which is not like a good representation of the data I'm importing. And if you do it like this, you get some articles from every period, which is much nicer. So suppose you've run this migration and you're almost about to go live. The editors of the client have already been working. They made manual edits because they seen some typos or edit images because it was needed. And then finally you say, oh wait, there's one field and it's not imported correctly. What do you do? Because if you're going to run this migration all over again, you're going to overwrite all the manual edits that your client has done, and they're not going to be happy. Okay, so there's a really cool feature that not many people know. There's the Overwrite Properties property in the YAML file when you specify the migration. So in the destination part, where you usually just say, okay, plug in entity node, meaning we are creating nodes. There's the Overwrite Properties, and this is just a list of fields that is whitelisted to be imported. So once you write those last two lines, it means only the category field is now being imported and the rest is ignored. So this is a really easy and quick hack to make sure that you run the migration for this field and this field only and leave out the rest. One more thing, Entity Generate. Entity Generate is a plugin that is made available by the Migrate Tools module, and it's a really simple shortcut to generate different types of entities all in one go. And tags is an example that's often used for this. If you have an article which contains tags, you can just import the article node and have the taxonomy terms created on the fly. So this is really nice and simple because you don't have to write two migrations, one for the taxonomy terms and one for the articles. But it also has some disadvantages, like you get no rollbacks, you get no mappings, you get no nothing. It's just that. But it means that it's great for things that don't have a source ID. Sometimes like tags are just like things in the fields, especially the way what I wrote this for, it had all keywords in one field, comma separated. So I'm just exploding it and making entities out of it. And the great thing about Migrate is because it sees here, it has a text field, it's going to look up what the tag field is configured as, see it's a taxonomy term reference, and it will just figure out everything it needs to know about the vocabulary and whatever it needs, and just generate those terms with just like 7 lines of code, which is pretty awesome, I think. Okay, so that was it. I hope this was useful. I'm sure that I haven't told everything. There's still a lot more to know and to learn, but I hope that everyone is now somewhat comfortable to get their hands dirty once the client needs you to write a migration. So some quick thank yous. Of course, our sponsors, Platinum and Gold sponsors, and you, the Drupal community, everyone who is here, my employer, Limon Groen. Without all those people, I wouldn't be doing this. So thanks. Now, are there any questions? We have no one in the room to run around with the mic, so that's just... Okay, thanks.
So my question is it good practice to have more than one source ID? in a migration. I mean, it happened to me once in a project. The client gave me a CSV, and I couldn't find a unique ID.
Yep.
But I couldn't found. But I could found if I combine two columns, I could create a unique ID.
Sure. Yeah. The combination of two fields can be unique together. That's correct. Sometimes, the type, and then per type there's a unique ID or something like that, and that's totally possible. Let's see. If we go all the way back and look at this source. Where is it? I think it's this one. No. No. Here we go. Here's the query, here's the fields, and here's the get IDs. So this is an array. It says artist ID, but in your situation, you would just add two fields to this array, and then you have two fields that together make up the unique ID, and that will also result in an extra column in the mapping table. So, for instance, the Migrate Lookup plugin knows to look up two values instead of one. It will just work. So, is it a good practice? Well, preferably you have a source that doesn't need this, but if you do need it, migration is completely set up to support that.
I've done this, but not like this. I've done it in the YAML files, the configuration. I put the idea of the name of the column for the source ID.
Okay, so you.
I've done it this way. I
Okay.
remember it was a long time ago. I don't remember how I did it, but it was.
Okay. So you probably combined them into one string and then use that as a lookup.
No, not actually. I think we created two columns on the database.
Okay.
I think it was source 24, source 92, and the destination ID. It was. So YAML, when you configure the YAML file with CSV source, you have parameter the key or IDs.
Yeah. Yeah, that is correct. If it's a CSV source, you're not actually writing this plugin because there's already a CSV source plugin, and then everything you need to configure is done in the YAML, and then the CSV plugin will do this part dynamically based on the configuration you're passing into it. But yeah, below the surface, this is what's happening. Yeah, correct. Thank you. Any more questions?
Hello, thank you for the session. I remember when I started to actually work with migrations, I had quite a lot of problems trying to debug it, and since then it passed a lot of time. So can you explain what tools and how actually you debug it currently?
Yeah, I'm using PHP Storm and Xdebug. So the debugging that is going on is usually most of the time in a process plugin. So in this transform method of a process plugin, that's where a lot of work happens. And then also a bit in the source plugin where the rows are prepared. Especially, I mean, the example I showed you was a pretty straightforward query, but sometimes you need some joins and other things going on there. So yeah, I basically just put in a breakpoint in PHP Storm and enable debugging in my browser with this browser extension and run the migration from the UI, because that's the easiest way usually to trigger.
If you don't use a custom processor, for example, you use standard plugins, get plugin, and the value is not there. Or you didn't face such situation?
If the value is not there in your processor, that usually means that there's a problem with the configuration in your YAML file.
Exactly. Is this migration? How to debug?
In that case, you have to go up a couple of levels There's a migrate executable, which is actually the worker that is running the migration, and that will be looping over everything that is in your YAML file, and that will have the raw source data for the current row available as well. So that's, yeah. What I usually do is in PHP Storm, you got this window in the debugger, which is called frames, which is actually like your stack trace. So you can move up a couple of levels and see where the point is, where you think, okay, so everything is still right here, and then from that point on, you have to go look where it goes wrong. Yeah, that's more like general debugging practice than that is specific to migrations, but that's what I do.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Okay. If we have source data and we removed some items from the source data, they will be automatically removed when we do the import next time?
No. No.
Okay.
It will not remove things.
Okay, thanks.
Please take a mic then.
Also, a classical error is to forget to re-import your YAML file after I've made some edition. So you insist or you make a point on that, and instead of running the drush config import command every time, I use the config deval module, which allow you to give a file, and every time you load the page on Drupal or stuff like that, it will automatically import the config for you.
Right, yeah.
So it's very easy to test.
Yeah, true. Yeah, so config devel or this.
Hello. Can you import paragraphs and couple them to a node with Migrate?
Yeah, you totally can.
And how?
How? I can. If you really want to know, just join me after, and I'll show you the code for a project where I did that. But on a global level, it means that you have to write 2 migrations. So first, you're writing a migration to import the content or whatever it is into paragraphs. Those are entities, so you can just create entities. And then after that, with migration lookup, you're connecting those entities to the nodes you're creating. Sorry? Yeah, it is a dependent migration. Yeah, it has some caveats though. You should really be aware that paragraphs support revisions. So when you import this node, then when you re-import the paragraphs, the revisions will go up. The node is still linked to the previous revision. So even if your paragraph has updated because you ran the migration again, you will not see it on the node. So there are some really tricky things going on. You really want to run those migrations together always.
First up, thanks for the talk. And I've done a couple of migrations in the past, and I was tasked with a problem which did not eventually result in the actual migration, but there was a problem that had to be solved at that time, and I wonder if there is any trick to it. The situation that was actually opposing the problem is I had a file base containing like 1.5 million files with no database adherence at all, so no unique IDs to these files other than the file name.
Yeah.
But depending on the sheer mass of the files, I couldn't really get a directory listing and be sure that all files are always there in the same order. So if you get a directory listing, the files will come in like a random order sometimes. Is there any trick on how anyone can build unique IDs for such source data in this case, that will ensure that migration of these files in this issue will be will be able to stop and re-continue after the stop.
Well, yeah, because when you say it stops, it means that it probably runs out of memory or runs out of something and then breaks down, right? Yeah. So I have not experienced this myself, fortunately, but I do know, it's a bit like generic knowledge that I haven't used myself, but there is something that's called a high water mark, which means that at a certain point, when memory is running out or time is running out or something, you can set a high watermark, which is like the storage of where you left off and where the migration can resume. So there is something in Migrate API to handle situations like that. I couldn't tell you exactly how to use it, but look at the high watermark. Okay. So, any other questions? I think we've run out of time, haven't we? And there's no questions. So, cool. Thanks again. And, well, come to me if you want to see the paragraphs example. Oh, one final thing. There's another migration session after this by Mohit. He's going to talk about dynamic migration. So migrations that adapt themselves to the source data, if I'm telling it correctly. So going to be interesting. Thanks.